There was a time when his name alone could define an entire era of action cinema, a time when audiences did not just watch him on screen, they believed in him. He was not just another Hollywood star. He was something else entirely, a symbol, a presence, a man who spoke about family with such intensity that millions of people around the world felt like they were part of it. For years, Vin Diesel did not just act in movies, he became the identity of one. The Fast and Furious franchise was not just a series of films, it was his kingdom. And inside that kingdom, he was not just the lead actor. He was the leader, the voice, the one who carried the emotional weight of a story that grew far beyond fast cars and street races. People did not question it, they accepted it. Because Vin Diesel was not built like other stars. He did not rely on charm in the traditional sense. He did not chase controversy for attention. He built something much more powerful. A character that felt unbreakable. A man who stood for loyalty, strength, and above all, family. And over time, that character became inseparable from who he was in real life. But that is where the story quietly begins to change. Because the stronger the image, the harder it becomes to escape it. In the early days, everything felt raw and real. The first films carried a different kind of energy. There was risk, there was emotion. There was a sense that these characters were still grounded in a world that made sense. And at the center of it all, Vin Diesel was not just performing. He was building something, carefully, deliberately, turning a simple action film into a global phenomenon. Then came the rise. Bigger budgets, bigger explosions, bigger expectations. The franchise evolved. Some would say it transformed. Others would say it lost something along the way. But one thing remained constant. Vin Diesel stayed at the center, not just as the face of the films, but as a driving force behind them. His influence grew, his control expanded, and with that, the pressure began to shift in ways most people could not see. Because when you become the face of something that large, you are no longer just an actor. You become responsible for keeping it alive. And that responsibility does not come without a cost. Behind the scenes, the industry was changing. Audiences were changing. The definition of a leading man was evolving. But Vin Diesel remained tied to the very thing that made him untouchable. The character of Dominic Toretto was no longer just a role. It was an expectation, one that had to be delivered again and again, no matter how much time had passed. And time was passing. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeable. Until it wasn't. Because while the movies continued to grow larger, louder, and more unbelievable, something else was happening in the background. Something quieter. Something more human. The kind of change that no script can hide forever. The man behind the character was aging. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would shock you overnight. But enough that, if you paid close attention, you could begin to see the difference. In the way he moved. In the way he spoke. In the energy that once felt endless, but now carried a different weight. And yet, the image remained the same. The same voice, the same lines, the same message about family. But for the first time, people started to feel something they had never felt before. A gap. A small distance between the myth and the reality. At first, it was easy to ignore. After all, this was Vin Diesel. The man who had survived decades in Hollywood without losing his identity. The man who had built an empire out of loyalty and consistency. The man who had turned a single role into something legendary. But legends come with a hidden rule. They are expected to stay the same. And that is a rule no one can follow forever. Because no matter how strong the image is, no matter how powerful the story becomes, there is always a moment when reality begins to catch up. A moment when the audience starts to notice the things they once overlooked. Not because they want to, but because they cannot help it. And for Vin Diesel, that moment did not arrive with a scandal. It did not come with a dramatic fall. It came quietly, through subtle changes, through shifting reactions, through a growing sense that something was different, even if no one could fully explain what it was. This is not the story of a man who lost everything. It is something far more complex. It is the story of a man who became so iconic, so deeply connected to a single idea that the world began to struggle with seeing him any other way, even as time moved forward, even as everything around him evolved. Because when you spend your life becoming a symbol, you do not get the luxury of changing without consequences. And now, at 58, the question is no longer about who Vin Diesel was. It is about what happens when the world starts to see the difference between who he used to be and who he is today. And that is where the real story begins. At his peak, there was no one quite like Vin Diesel. Not because he was the most versatile actor in Hollywood, and not because he chased awards or critical acclaim. His power came from something much harder to define. He understood something most actors never truly grasp. He knew how to build identity. While others were chasing roles, he was building a legacy. And that legacy was anchored in one thing: control. The Fast and Furious series did not just grow into a global phenomenon by accident. Behind the explosions, behind the billion-dollar box office numbers, there was a steady hand guiding its direction. And that hand belonged to him. This is where the myth became something much more real. Vin Diesel was not just acting as Dominic Toretto. He was shaping him, protecting him, expanding him into something larger than life. A character who could not lose. A character who could not be weak. A character who always stood at the center of everything. And audiences loved it. Because in a world that constantly changes, consistency feels like safety. Every film delivered the same core promise. No matter how big the stunts became, no matter how unrealistic the action looked, at the heart of it all, there was always one message that never changed: family. But behind that message, something else was happening. Power was shifting. As the franchise grew, so did his influence. Creative decisions, story direction, character arcs. These were no longer just studio choices. They were part of a vision that he was deeply involved in. And when an actor becomes that involved, the line between performance and control starts to disappear. That is when things begin to get complicated. Because control can protect a legacy, but it can also trap it. There were whispers. Quiet at first, the kind of industry conversations that never fully make it to the public, but are always there beneath the surface. Discussions about creative differences, about tension on set, about how difficult it becomes when one person holds too much weight in a project that large. Then those whispers started to get louder. The most visible crack came when Dwayne Johnson entered the picture. At first, it seemed like a perfect match. Two powerful figures sharing the same screen. Two different styles, but both commanding attention in their own way. For a moment, it worked. The energy felt fresh. The franchise felt alive again. But chemistry on screen does not always mean harmony behind it. What started as subtle tension slowly turned into something more public. Carefully worded interviews, indirect comments, moments where it became clear that not everything was as united as the films suggested. And for the first time, audiences began to notice something unusual. The idea of family, the very foundation of the franchise, was not as solid behind the scenes. This was not just a disagreement between actors. It was a sign of something deeper. Because when a franchise becomes too centered around one identity, any challenge to that identity feels like a threat, not just to the story, but to the entire structure that has been built around it. And Vin Diesel was no longer just protecting a character. He was protecting an empire. But empires have a weakness. They depend on balance. Too many strong personalities, too many creative directions, too much pressure to keep delivering something bigger than before. At some point, something has to give. And in this case, what started to give was the illusion. The illusion that everything was perfectly aligned. The illusion that the family on screen reflected the reality behind the camera. For years, fans had believed that what they saw was real, that the bond was genuine, that the connection between the cast extended far beyond the script, and for a long time, maybe it did. But success changes things. It amplifies differences. It magnifies egos. It creates situations where maintaining unity becomes harder than creating spectacle. And as the franchise pushed forward, growing larger and more ambitious with each installment, The pressure on Vin Diesel became something few people could fully understand, because he was no longer just part of the machine. He was the machine. Every success reinforced his position. Every criticism pointed back to him. Every decision carried more weight than the last. And when you reach that level of control, there is a hidden cost. You become responsible not just for what works, but for what doesn't. At first, it did not seem like a problem. The films were still making money. The audience was still showing up. The brand was still strong. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. But underneath that surface, the cracks were beginning to form. Small at first, almost invisible, until they weren't. Because the higher you climb, the harder it becomes to adjust when things start to shift. And Vin Diesel had built something so massive, so tightly connected to his identity, that stepping away was never really an option. He had to keep going. He had to keep delivering. He had to keep being the same man the world expected him to be, even if that man was slowly becoming harder to maintain. And that is where the pressure truly begins. Not from the outside, but from within. For a long time, the world only saw the surface. Fast cars, explosions, loyalty, brotherhood. Everything looked controlled. Everything looked intentional. Everything looked like it was exactly where it needed to be. But the truth about pressure is that it does not always reveal itself through chaos. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in distance, in the subtle shift of energy that people cannot quite explain but can definitely feel. And that shift began to surround Vin Diesel. At first, it was easy to ignore. After all, this was a franchise that had already survived more than most. It had reinvented itself multiple times. It had turned street racing into global espionage. It had pushed the limits of what audiences were willing to accept. And somehow, it kept working. But something was different now. Not in the explosions, not in the scale, but in the way people started to talk about it. The conversations changed. There were more questions, more skepticism, more moments where fans began to say things they had never said before. Words like repetitive, words like forced, words that slowly chipped away at the untouchable image the franchise once had. And at the center of all of it, whether people said it directly or not, was him. Because when you are the face of something for that long, you do not get to separate yourself from its evolution or its decline. The tension that had once been whispered about behind the scenes became harder to ignore, especially when it involved someone as visible as Dwayne Johnson. This was not just another co-star. This was someone who represented a different kind of power, a different kind of presence, someone who could stand in the same frame and not feel smaller, someone who brought his own audience, his own identity, his own way of doing things. And for a moment, it created something rare. Balance. But balance does not last when two forces are moving in different directions. The conflict was never fully explained in detail. It did not need to be. The public saw enough. Social media posts that felt slightly too pointed. Interviews that carried a tone just beneath the surface. The absence of shared scenes. The kind of details that, on their own, might mean nothing, but together told a very different story. And people started to notice. Not just the tension, but what it represented. Because this was no longer just about two actors. It was about control. Who defines the direction of something that big? Who gets to shape its future? Who decides what stays and what changes? And in that kind of environment, compromise becomes difficult, especially when one side has spent years building the foundation. Vin Diesel was not just protecting a role. He was protecting a vision that had become deeply personal. But that vision was now being questioned. Not aggressively, not all at once, but slowly, through audience reactions, through critical reviews, through the growing feeling that the formula, once so powerful, was starting to show its limits. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because when something stops evolving, it does not immediately fail. It lingers. It continues, but it begins to feel different, less exciting, less urgent, less real. The stakes become harder to believe. The emotions become harder to connect with. And the character, once seen as unbreakable, begins to feel predictable. For years, predictability was part of the appeal. Now, it was becoming a problem. And yet nothing could change too quickly, because change carries risk. And when you are responsible for something that large, risk is not just creative. It is financial. It is reputational. It affects hundreds of people behind the scenes. It affects an entire brand that has been carefully built over decades. So instead of a dramatic shift, what happened was something far more subtle. The franchise kept moving forward. The same tone, the same themes, the same character at the center. But the reaction was no longer the same. And that is when the pressure begins to take a different form. Not loud, not explosive, but constant. The kind of pressure that comes from knowing something is changing, even if you are not ready to admit it. The kind of pressure that comes from holding on to something that the world is slowly starting to outgrow. For Vin Diesel, this was not a moment of collapse. It was a moment of tension between what had always worked and what might not work anymore. And the most difficult part about that kind of moment is this. There is no clear turning point, no single decision, no obvious mistake, just a growing realization that the path forward is no longer as clear as it once was. And yet, stopping is not an option. Because when your identity is tied to something that powerful, walking away does not feel like freedom. It feels like losing everything you spent your life building. So you keep going, even when the signals begin to change, even when the reactions begin to shift, even when deep down you start to understand that the story is no longer just about success. It is about what happens when success becomes something you have to defend. And that is a very different kind of battle. One that does not happen on screen, but one that changes everything behind it. There are moments in life that no amount of success can protect you from. Moments that cut through the image, through the identity, through everything that has been carefully built over years. Moments that do not just change a story, but redefine it completely. For Vin Diesel, that moment came in a way no one was prepared for. It was not a scandal. It was not a failure. It was a loss. When Paul Walker passed away, the world did not just lose an actor. The Fast and Furious lost something far more important than a character. It lost a piece of its heart. And for the first time, the idea of family was no longer just a line in a script. It became real. The bond between Vin Diesel and Paul Walker had always been part of the narrative. Fans believed in it. They felt it. It gave the franchise something emotional that went beyond action. But when that bond was broken in real life, everything changed. Suddenly, the story they had been telling on screen collided with reality. And reality does not follow a script. The production had to stop. Plans had to change. The future of the franchise became uncertain in a way it had never been before. Not because of money, not because of audience interest, but because something essential was missing. Something that could not be replaced. For Vin Diesel, this was not just a professional challenge. It was personal. Because when you spend years building something alongside someone, when you share that level of visibility, that level of pressure, that level of connection, the line between colleague and family becomes blurred. And when that connection is suddenly gone, what remains is not just grief, it is silence. A silence that no performance can fully hide. The decision to continue the franchise was not simple. It was not just about finishing a film. It was about deciding whether the story could still exist without one of its core pillars. Whether the message of family could still feel authentic after such a loss. And somehow, they chose to continue. But continuing does not mean moving on. Because even as the films resumed, even as the production regained momentum, something had permanently shifted. The energy was different. The tone was different. The emotional weight carried something that had never been there before. Grief. And grief does something interesting. It deepens some things, and it complicates others. On screen, the tribute to Paul Walker became one of the most emotional moments in the franchise. It connected with audiences in a way that no action sequence ever could. It reminded people why they cared in the first place. But behind the scenes, it created a different kind of challenge. Because how do you continue a story built on brotherhood when one of the brothers is gone? How do you keep delivering the same message, the same intensity, the same connection, when the reality behind it has changed so dramatically? For Vin Diesel, this was not just about honoring a friend. It was about carrying something forward that no longer felt the same. And that is a heavy responsibility, because the audience does not just expect a movie. They expect a feeling, the same feeling they had before, the same connection, the same belief. But feelings are not something you can recreate on command, especially when they were once real. As the franchise moved forward, that absence remained. Not always visible, not always discussed, but always there, in the background, in the tone, in the subtle way the story tried to hold on to something that had already changed. And for the first time, Vin Diesel was not just leading a franchise. He was carrying a memory, trying to preserve it, trying to protect it, trying to make sure it still meant something. But there is a quiet truth about loss. No matter how much you honor it, no matter how much you hold on to it, it changes the way everything feels moving forward. And sometimes, without realizing it, you begin to hold on to the past so tightly that it becomes harder to fully step into the future. For the audience, the film still worked. They still delivered spectacle. They still carried the message. But underneath it all, there was a new layer, one that could not be ignored. Because for those who were paying attention, it was clear. This was no longer just a story about family. It was a story about trying to hold on to something that had already been lost. And that changes everything, not all at once, but slowly, in ways that only become visible over time. And for Vin Diesel, that change was only just beginning to reveal itself. After the loss, everything moved forward. But it did not move forward the same way. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. The Fast and Furious was still massive. The numbers were still strong. The scale was still growing. Each new release tried to outdo the last, pushing further into spectacle, further into impossibility, further into a version of action that no longer followed the rules of reality. And at the center of it all, Vin Diesel remained exactly where he had always been. Or at least, that is what it looked like. Because the truth about pressure is that it often hides behind consistency. The audience still saw Dominic Toretto, the same voice, the same calm intensity, the same message about family. But behind that consistency, something else was happening. The responsibility had changed. Before, he was part of something that felt shared, a group, a dynamic, a balance between personalities that made the story feel alive. But now, whether he chose it or not, more of that weight fell onto him. More expectations, more scrutiny, more pressure to keep everything working. Because when something survives a tragedy, it does not just continue. It becomes something people watch more closely. Every decision matters more. Every performance is analyzed differently. Every change is noticed. And this is where the pressure becomes internal, because no one on the outside can fully understand what it feels like to carry something that used to be shared, to step into a space that once had another presence in it, to continue telling a story that was never meant to be told this way. So you compensate. You hold tighter to what still works. You repeat the elements that audiences recognize. You reinforce the identity that made everything successful in the first place. And for a while, that strategy works. The films still deliver. The audience still shows up. The machine keeps moving. But there is a hidden cost to repetition. It slowly reduces flexibility. It makes change harder. It locks you into a version of yourself that becomes more difficult to evolve. And over time, people begin to notice. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the reactions shift. What once felt powerful begins to feel familiar. What once felt emotional begins to feel expected. What once felt authentic begins to feel constructed. And this is where the situation becomes complicated. Because from a business perspective, nothing is broken. The franchise is still successful. The brand is still strong. The recognition is still there. But from a creative perspective, something is starting to drift. And when those two realities exist at the same time, it creates a very specific kind of pressure. The pressure to keep doing what works, even if it no longer feels the same. For Vin Diesel, this is not just about acting. It is about maintaining a legacy that is deeply tied to one character, one message, one identity. And the longer that identity remains unchanged, the harder it becomes to step outside of it. Because the audience does not just expect consistency, they demand it. They want the same feeling, the same tone, the same version of him that they have come to recognize over the years. But time does not stand still. People change. Energy changes. Presence changes. And trying to maintain the exact same image over decades comes with a cost that is not always visible on screen. It shows up in subtle ways, in the pacing of scenes, in the delivery of lines, in the overall energy that once felt effortless, but now feels more controlled, more measured, more deliberate. And yet, the expectation remains unchanged. He still has to be the anchor. He still has to carry the emotional core. He still has to represent the idea of family, even when the reality behind that idea has become more complicated. And this is where the pressure reaches a new level, not because things are falling apart, but because they are staying the same. And sometimes, staying the same for too long becomes its own kind of challenge. Because the world around you is always moving forward. Audiences evolve, tastes shift, new stars emerge, new styles take over. And if you remain exactly where you are, eventually the distance between you and the present begins to grow. Slowly, quietly, until one day, it becomes impossible to ignore. And for Vin Diesel, that distance was beginning to form, not as a dramatic gap, but as a subtle difference between what the audience once felt and what they were starting to feel now. And that difference is where everything begins to change. At some point, the change becomes visible, not in a headline, not in a single moment, but in the way people start to look a little longer than they used to, in the way comments begin to shift, in the quiet realization that something feels different, even if no one says it directly. For Vin Diesel, that moment did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually. Because aging in Hollywood is not just about time. It is about contrast. Every new appearance is compared to an older version. Every scene is measured against a memory. Every movement, every expression, every detail is placed next to an image that has been frozen in the minds of millions for years. And the comparison is unavoidable. In his early years, his presence felt effortless. There was a natural intensity in the way he carried himself, a stillness that made him feel in control, even in the middle of chaos. He did not need to move quickly. He did not need to speak loudly. His presence alone carried weight. But presence changes, not disappears, changes. Subtly at first, then more noticeably. The physicality that once defined him began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough that audiences who had followed him for years started to see the difference. The sharp edges softened. The movements became more measured. The energy that once felt raw now felt controlled. And control, while powerful, does not always feel the same as intensity. This is not a flaw. It is reality. But in an industry built on illusion, reality can feel uncomfortable. Because the character of Dominic Toretto was never designed to age in a visible way. He was built to be constant, solid, unchanging. A figure who could stand in the same space, delivering the same message, no matter how much time passed. And for a long time, that illusion held. But illusions are fragile. They depend on alignment between what people expect and what they see. And when that alignment starts to shift, even slightly, the audience begins to notice, not with rejection, but with awareness. The comments began to change, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but honestly, people started pointing out the differences, the way he looked, the way he moved, the way his energy on screen no longer matched the version they remembered from years before. And this is where things become difficult. Because no one is criticizing the person. They are reacting to the difference, the gap between memory and reality. And that gap is something no one can close completely. For Vin Diesel, this creates a unique kind of pressure. He is not just being compared to other actors. He is being compared to himself, a version of himself that exists in the past, preserved in films that do not change, do not age, do not evolve. But he does. And the challenge is not just physical. It is emotional. Because when your identity is built around consistency, any visible change feels like a disruption, even if that change is natural, even if it is expected, even if it is something every person experiences. The audience does not always process it that way. They process it through contrast, through expectation, through the image they have held on to for years. And when that image begins to shift, the reaction is inevitable, not because they want to see something different, but because they cannot ignore it anymore. And yet, the role remains the same tone, the same dialogue, the same emotional weight, the same responsibility to carry a character that was designed to feel timeless. But time does not allow that. So, what happens instead is something more subtle. The performance becomes more controlled, more intentional, less about raw energy, and more about maintaining presence. And that shift, while understandable, creates a different feeling on screen, one that audiences begin to pick up on, not as a failure, but as a change. And change, in a world that expects consistency, always stands out. This is not the story of someone losing their ability. It is the story of someone navigating something unavoidable, trying to remain the same in a world that no longer sees them the same way. And that is a challenge no script can fully solve. Because at the end of the day, the audience is not just watching a character. They are watching time. And time always leaves a mark, no matter how strong the image once was, no matter how powerful the legacy still is. And for Vin Diesel, that mark was becoming impossible to ignore. Not because it changed who he was, but because it changed how the world saw him. There is a moment in every long career when the question quietly changes. It is no longer about how powerful someone is. It becomes about how relevant they still feel. For Vin Diesel, that moment did not arrive with failure. It did not come with a box office collapse or a public rejection. In fact, on paper, everything still looked successful. The Fast and Furious was still generating massive numbers. The global audience was still there. The brand still had recognition that most actors could only dream of. But relevance is not measured by numbers alone. It is measured by feeling, and that feeling was beginning to shift. The industry around him was evolving faster than ever before. New faces were rising. New styles of storytelling were taking over. The definition of a leading man was changing. Audiences were no longer drawn only to strength and dominance. They were connecting with vulnerability, complexity, unpredictability. And this is where the contrast became more visible. Because Vin Diesel had built his entire identity around something very specific. Stability, consistency, strength. A presence that did not change. But in a world that now valued change, that consistency started to feel different. Not wrong, just distant. The characters that were gaining attention were not untouchable figures. They were flawed, they struggled, they evolved, they surprised the audience. They felt human in a way that allowed people to connect with them more deeply. Meanwhile, Dominic Toretto remained exactly what he had always been, unshaken, unbreakable, unchanged. And for years, that was the appeal. Now, it was becoming a limitation. Because when a character does not evolve, the audience eventually stops evolving with them. And when that happens, the connection weakens. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The conversations around the franchise began to reflect this shift, not in the form of backlash, but in tone. People were no longer talking about what might happen next. They were talking about what they had already seen before. The unpredictability was gone. The tension was reduced. The emotional stakes felt familiar. And familiarity, over time, becomes predictable. This is where relevance becomes fragile, because it is not about how big something is. It is about how much people feel when they experience it. And that feeling was no longer as strong as it once was. For Vin Diesel, this creates a situation that is incredibly difficult to navigate. because he is not failing. He is not being replaced. He is not disappearing. He is still present, still leading, still carrying the same role that made him iconic. But the world around him has moved into a different rhythm. And matching that rhythm requires something that his current identity does not easily allow. Change. Real change. Not just bigger action. Not just higher stakes. But a shift in character. A willingness to let the audience see something different. Something less controlled. Something less perfect. And that is where the challenge becomes personal. Because changing the character means changing the identity. Not just on screen, but in the way he is perceived. And when that identity has been built over decades, reinforced through multiple films, and tied so closely to a global brand, making that kind of change is not simple. It is not just creative. It is psychological. It requires letting go of something that has defined you for years. And that is not something most people are willing to do easily. So, instead, the structure remains. The character stays the same. The tone stays consistent. The message stays intact. But the audience changes. And when the audience changes faster than the story, a gap begins to form. A quiet distance between what is being delivered and what people are starting to look for. For some viewers, it does not matter. They still enjoy the spectacle. They still appreciate the consistency. They still connect with the idea of family. But for others, something feels missing, not in the scale, not in the production, but in the emotion, in the unpredictability, in the sense that they are watching something evolve. And once that feeling is gone, it becomes very difficult to bring it back, because evolution cannot be forced. It has to be real. And for Vin Diesel, the question is no longer about whether he can continue. He can. The franchise can. The audience will still show up. The real question is something deeper. What happens when continuing is no longer enough? What happens when maintaining the same identity starts to create distance instead of connection? And what happens when the world is ready for something new, but you are still holding on to what made you who you are? That is the moment where everything becomes uncertain. Not because of failure, but because of possibility. And possibility, for someone who has built their career on certainty, can be the most uncomfortable place of all.